Hello, my name is Aisa Youssef, and I'm a 28-year-old blogger. I write the blog iceturtlegirl.blog. And how iceturtlegirl.blog came to be was I started the blog in 2014. And during that time, there was a lot of turmoil in the world, as there always is every single year. There's always a lot of turmoil in the world. And during that time, Black Lives Matter was just becoming a phrase on everybody's tongue. The organization was becoming a big thing. Everybody was talking about Black Lives Matter. It had really started around the Trayvon Martin situation, but had carried on into what we now know as Black Lives Matter during the Michael Brown Jr. situation that happened during that time. And everybody's up in arms, and everybody, rightfully so, was mad and frustrated, and they needed a way and an outlet to basically say their frustration out in public. And so Black Lives Matter became a phrase. During that time, there was also a big climate march that happened in New York City. There were a lot of different things going on indigenous reservations, and there was just a lot going on, a lot of turmoil going on in the world at that time. And me, as a young person at that time, I felt that I had a voice, and I wanted to put my voice out there into the world. So I started my blog, iceturtlegirl.blog, and I've been running it ever since 2014, and it's my baby. I love it. And to me, the reason I started iceturtlegirl.blog is I felt I was a young person with a voice, especially a young female, Black, indigenous person with a voice. And I felt my voice should be heard by others. So I started writing. I, growing up, was not really into writing in that way. I did have, of course I had journals like most young people do, and I tried to recount certain events happening in my life at those times. And going through school, English wasn't my favorite subject, but I did like it. I did like writing stories. Stories to me were something that I valued growing up. I used to write lots of fantastical stories, but they all had something to do with my culture and my heritage. And when I was like 8 or 9 years old, 7 maybe, I wrote a story about a young girl, and she was half African and half indigenous, North American. And basically the story goes, I actually don't have a copy of it anymore, unfortunately, because it got lost. But from what I'm recalling, the story was basically about how, and it was during slavery, so it was about how an indigenous woman ended up on one of the slave ships going to Africa. And during that time, as we all know, indigenous people were slaves at that time. And this was like right before they would come and take Africans from Africa to use them as slaves. So this woman ended up on this ship and basically had a baby with an African man. The African man did not end up as a slave, but the indigenous person, the indigenous woman, she ended up going back to Turtle Island, as we call it. And it's basically the story of how the daughter lives in Africa with her father, but is yearning for the connection to her mother. And so she goes on this journey to go back to Turtle Island and like I said, this is during slavery, so there's lots of slave ships going back and forth from Africa. So she ends up on one of the slave ships to go back to Turtle Island to find her mom. And when she gets there, she realizes that her mom is actually being held captive. And so she has to find a way to tell her dad. And her dad ends up over in Turtle Island in America. And it's a whole story. But the reason I wanted to write that story was because I am of indigenous and Black ancestry. American Black ancestry. And my lineage is indigenous from Turtle Island and coming from slavery as a Black person. So I want to write that story. And so that's one of the earliest stories I think I remember writing, and it had everything to do with my culture and my heritage and what mattered to me as a young Black, Indigenous person, you know? And so fast forward, when I start writing my blog and start writing all these blog posts about my culture and about what's going on in the world from the landscape of being a Black and Indigenous woman, I really felt comfortable writing those stories. I think storytelling is really, really important for all groups of people to do, because everybody deserves to have their stories told and have their stories out there. Because 9 times out of 10, your story is probably not going to, make the front page of the news. But you should still tell your story because it's important, because it represents who you are. But I think it's extra important for people of color, Indigenous people, Black people, brown people, people of color, to write stories about themselves and about their communities. Because we are the ones who have the most to lose when it comes to things like racism, when it comes to things like climate change, when it comes to things like just the rights of Mother Earth. Because as people of color, as Black people, as Indigenous people, we are the closest to the earth that you can get. There's no coincidence that there is pipelines on Indigenous reservations. There's no coincidence that there are smokestacks next to urban cities. There's no coincidence that these things are where they are. And so, as we are the most connected to the earth, we are also the most affected by climate change, by earthly changes. And I think it is very, very important to tell your stories. Get your stories out there. Write a blog. Start videography if that's your thing. Start doing vlogs, or start doing movies, Write music if that's your thing, or start a podcast. Even if you're just writing in a journal every day about your daily experiences as a person of color, as Indigenous person, as a Black person in this world, it is still very valid and it's still very important for you to put your stories out there, especially as a young person. Because right now, with everything going on between climate change and all the earthly changes going on and racism and you name it, it's happening. With all of these things, and right now, being that we are in a global pandemic, it's even more. I think it's really important for us to be telling our stories as young people, because people need to know. People need to know that this is what was happening during this time, and we need to be telling our story. Because, as we know, many history books that are out there aren't telling the accurate stories of what's going on during those time periods. A lot of them are very whitewashed, and they are very much telling half-truths of what is going on, and sometimes blatantly lies, about what's going on during those time periods that a lot of us didn't grow up in. So we are forced to believe these lies, and then learn about the real truth later. But I don't want that to be the next generation's what they have to go through. We should be telling our own stories now so that the next generations can learn about us and what we did and the accomplishments that we made in our societies, in our world, so that they could have a better world to live in. That is why I value storytelling on such a deep level, because storytelling is so important to the landscape of what's going on daily, Even something as silly, and I know it's silly, but even something as silly as TikTok, which is an app that young people are using every day to express themselves. They're doing silly dances and they're doing other things, but they are also doing things that are telling their daily stories, And I value that, and I think that's important too, because storytelling as young people, as people of color, as women, as Indigenous people, as Black people, we have to be our own storytellers, because no one is going to tell our stories for us. And if we want an accurate depiction of what is actually going on in society, we have to tell our own stories. We have to. Because too many times in history, our stories have been misconstrued, and they're not always the truth. So we have to tell our own stories and be our own storytellers. And, it's easy. You don't have to put any pressure on yourself. You don't have to be one of those people who is like, I'm not good at writing. I'm not really good at photography. I'm not really good at videography. And this isn't really my thing. It's as simple as you're on Instagram, right? And you're taking pictures of things going on in your life all the time, right? You're a storyteller. You know, you're on TikTok and you're telling your story to people, millions of people all over the world. You're a storyteller. You know, there are many ways now in 2020 and in this new millennium that we are in. There are so many different ways to tell your story, to get your story out there. And it just takes you and the confidence that you have to be able to put your stories out there. You know, for me, it's writing. I love writing my blog. It's my baby. It's something I cherish with my whole heart. And I love being able to have that as a platform to tell my own stories and how I feel about things going on in society. And, you know, when I first started, you know, I started writing about things as simple as, you know, what was going on with, you know, black people, indigenous people, because that's what I know. Things going on with the earth, because that's what I know. And that's mostly my focus on what I talk about on my blog. But I do, you know, talk about other things. But for the most part, those are the things that I write a lot about, because those are the things that I grew up around. You know, I grew up around black people, and I grew up around indigenous people, and I grew up around loving the earth and taking care of the earth and understanding her. And so for me, it's like, write about what you know. Talk about what you know. Videography, photography, however you decide to tell your story, talk about what you know. You know, it can be super simple. It can just be about, you know, how you started your garden during quarantine, right? Right now we're in quarantine because it's 2020 and we're going through a global pandemic. You could write about how you started a garden during the quarantine and how you took all these pictures of your garden and tell the story of how, okay, so this was when it first started, and this is now, and this is now, and this is now, and the stages of how your plants grew, the stages of how your vegetables grew, you know? There are so many different ways in 2020 to tell your stories, and I just think that it's really important, especially for the earth. Climate justice, climate changes, earth changes, all those types of things are happening on a daily basis, and they're continuing to happen, even during a global pandemic. These things are happening every day. And I think it's very valuable that we are able to tell our stories as climate warriors, you know? Even if you don't see yourself as a climate warrior, even if you've never been to a climate march or done anything climate related, or, you know, even like as simple as cleaned out a river or did anything that was you perceive as, you know, being a part of a climate movement, you still are valuable. Do you recycle? Then you're a part of this climate movement. Do you start a garden during quarantine? You're a part of this climate movement. And I think it's important to document these things because, again, things are not always told in truth when we aren't telling our own stories. And so I just think it's important that we as a community tell our own stories, and we make sure that our stories are accurate and they are of truth and they are of who we are and they represent who we are as a people. So I encourage everyone watching this to please go out, tell your stories, write about it, sing about it, film it, do a podcast, write a blog, do whatever you feel is necessary, but document the things going on in your life and document the things that you do to help make this planet and Mother Earth a better place, because we are all doing our part. All of these movements that we are all a part of all have one common goal, and that is to live on Mother Earth in harmony and in balance with Mother Earth. And so all of what we're doing is important to the landscape of a global climate movement, and I feel like those things need to be documented. So, to all my young people out there who I know have iPhones and can get on TikTok in a second, please make sure you're telling your stories, because it's important and it's valuable. And especially as young, black, indigenous, and brown people, we have to be telling our stories. We just really need to get them out there because it's important, and because it is going to be a lasting legacy for the next generation to be able to get out and fight, because there's a long road ahead of us, but we are better when we tell our stories. Thank you.